The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the wet asphalt, the reflection shimmering like a restless heartbeat. Sarah Whitman gripped the steering wheel, forcing herself to breathe. This wasn't supposed to happen. She and her husband had just finished dinner at their favorite spot, a quiet little diner they'd been going to for years. A simple night, a normal night until the sirens wailed behind them. The officer's boots scuffed against the pavement as he approached. Deputy Reed. She recognized him. He had been to the community center before, always watching, never speaking. "Evening, ma'am," he said, voice clipped, eyes shadowed beneath his cap. "License and registration." From the passenger seat, David Whitman, her husband, shifted slightly. He was tense, reading the situation, just like he always did. Sarah reached for the glove compartment, hands steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" Reed's flashlight swept over them, pausing on David. His lips curled slightly. "Both of you, step out of the vehicle." The tension in the air snapped like a pulled wire. Sarah hesitated. "We're just heading home, officer." "Step out. Now." His voice was different this time, colder, final. David exhaled sharply. "Sarah, let's do what he says." She nodded and reached for the handle. The second she pushed the door open, everything changed. A sharp movement, a shout, a gunshot, loud, brutal, final. Pain punched through her chest like fire. The world blurred. She fell back, gasping, her hands pressing against the warmth spreading across her blouse. The last thing she saw was David lunging for her before the world faded to black. The heavy bag shuddered with each strike, the dull thud of fists against canvas echoing through the nearly empty gym. David Whitman stood behind it, holding it steady as 16-year-old Jordan Carter unloaded a series of sharp, controlled punches. Sweat dripped from the boy's brow, his breath coming fast and uneven. "Control your breathing, Jordan," David said, his voice calm but firm. "Power doesn't come from anger, it comes from discipline." Jordan gritted his teeth, threw another punch. "Then why does it feel like the angrier I get, the stronger I am?" David studied him, his dark eyes unreadable. At 45, with broad shoulders and a body that had been conditioned for war, he had the presence of a man who had once been a weapon. Now, he tried to be something else, a mentor, a guide. But tonight, he was unraveling. "You think anger makes you strong?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "I used to think that too." Jordan stepped back, rubbing his sore knuckles. And David looked away, his gaze distant. "And then I learned that anger burns out fast. Discipline, that's what keeps you standing when everything else falls apart." The gym doors creaked open. A chill ran through David's spine before he even turned. Jessica Whitman walked in. Even after all these years, she still moved with quiet confidence. Her warm brown skin glowed under the fluorescent lights, her dark curls tied back in a loose ponytail. A few teens trailed behind her, carrying art supplies, her students, her purpose. "Looks like you two are working hard," she said, smiling at Jordan before her eyes met David's. And in that moment, for the first time since the night he lost Sarah, he felt something crack inside him. Because Jessica wasn't supposed to be here, Sarah was. Martin Caldwell swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the way the scotch caught the dim light of his study. The room smelled of old leather and wealth, the kind built on secrets and fear. Across from him, his son Chase slouched in a chair, eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. He looked like a kid caught sneaking out past curfew. "They weren't supposed to kill her," Chase muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Martin sighed, setting his glass down with a deliberate clink. "Complications arise in these situations." Chase's face paled further. "Complications? You told me they were just gonna scare her." His fingers drummed anxiously against the armrest. "Now the whole damn town is talking about it. And her husband." Martin held up a hand, silencing him. "Her husband is one man." He leaned forward, voice lowering. "And I've crushed bigger problems than one grieving ex-military nobody." Chase shook his head, swallowing hard. "Yeah. Then why does everyone look like they just saw a ghost?" Martin frowned, his son's fear beginning to irritate him. Chase had never had the stomach for the business, too soft, too reckless. Before Martin could respond, the door creaked open and Reed stepped inside, his uniform disheveled, his face lined with stress. "We have a problem," he said, voice tight. "He's not grieving, he's hunting." For the first time that night, Martin's grip on his glass tightened. Because deep down in the part of him that had survived too many power plays to ignore his instincts, he knew he wasn't dealing with just another man. He was dealing with a storm, one that had been trained to destroy everything in its path. David Whitman sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and sweat, the kind of place designed to make a man feel small, powerless. Too bad for them David was neither. Across from him, Lisa Foster, a state-appointed attorney, shuffled through a stack of files. She was young, sharp-eyed, and radiated the kind of bureaucratic confidence that came from knowing the law was supposed to be on her side. "Mr. Whitman, I've been assigned to your case," she said, glancing at him over her glasses. "I should warn you, the charges are serious. Assaulting police officers, resisting arrest. They murdered my wife." David's voice was flat, but there was something beneath it. A quiet, razor-sharp edge. Foster paused, studying him. "I understand you're grieving, but accusations like that won't help your case. The official report states that Officer Reynolds discharged his weapon." David leaned forward just enough to make the chain rattle. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and unreadable. "You think this is grief?" She hesitated. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Grief is what happens when someone dies of old age, or an accident, or something fair." He let the words settle like dust in the air. This is something else," Foster swallowed. "The sheriff's office claims you escalated the situation." David's lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. "And I bet the dashcam footage backs that up, right?" Her silence told him everything he needed to know. David sat back, closing his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, the cold, detached part of him, the part he hadn't accessed in years, was wide awake. Lisa Foster thought she was talking to a man preparing for trial. She had no idea she was sitting across from a man preparing for war. The cell was cold, not just from the air, but from the kind of stillness that seeped into a man's bones. David Whitman sat on the edge of the metal cot, his back against the cinder block wall, his mind running calculations like a machine. They thought they had him trapped. They were wrong. A soft scrape echoed from outside. The guard on duty, Miller, was making his rounds, the rhythm of his boots against the floor predictable, lazy. He wasn't worried about the man inside. To him, David was just another prisoner, another case file waiting to disappear into the system. He had no idea what kind of man he'd locked up. David's fingers traced the edges of the small envelope that had been slipped under his cell door an hour ago. No one had seen it happen. No one had taken responsibility. But it was here, and that meant someone out there knew what was coming. Inside, there was a single piece of paper. One typed message: "The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Help is coming. Stay ready, Cypher." David stared at the words, his heartbeat slow and steady. The game had changed. The overhead lights flickered just once, but it was enough. A subtle cue. The power was being tested. Someone was setting the stage. David smirked, standing up and stretching his shoulders. He had spent 15 years training the best soldiers in the world how to escape, evade, and eliminate threats. Now, it was time to put that training to work. By the time the next guard came to check on him, David Whitman would be long gone. A grainy video flickered onto screens across the country before the local police could bury it. The footage was raw, unedited. No dramatic angles, no special effects, just cold, undeniable truth. The timestamp showed 9:47 p.m. The Oak Ridge County Sheriff's cruiser sat parked under the dim glow of a streetlight. The camera captured everything in crisp detail. Sarah Whitman, standing beside the car, calm, composed, unarmed. David Whitman, hands raised, eyes locked onto the officers. A man who had faced war zones with less fear than he felt in that moment, and then movement. A shove, a flash of panic. A gunshot. Sarah staggered back, clutching her chest. David lunged, but the second shot knocked him to the ground. There was no weapon. No threat, just execution. The clip ended. Silence followed, then chaos. The video exploded across social media, news stations, underground forums. The people of Oak Ridge saw what they were never meant to see. The sheriff's office scrambled, issuing statements about technical malfunctions and misinterpretations, but it was too late. David watched from a dimly lit motel room, his face unreadable. He had expected proof. But watching it, seeing the exact moment Sarah was taken from him, it wasn't justice, it was fuel. His hands curled into fists as the voice in his head, the one he had kept buried for years, whispered, "Burn them all." A knock at the door, a voice, "Whitman, it's time." David took one last look at the screen before shutting it off. The war had just begun. The warehouse stood at the edge of town, a hulking skeleton of rusted steel and cracked concrete. It had been abandoned for years, but tonight it was alive, filled with the quiet hum of men loading crates, exchanging low murmurs, the occasional flick of a cigarette lighter. They had no idea they were being watched. David Whitman crouched in the darkness, his breath slow, measured. He had spent the past 3 days dismantling Sheriff Dalton's operation piece by piece. Every stash house torched, every courier taken off the board. He wasn't just taking revenge, he was burning their empire to the ground. He adjusted the small detonator in his hand, watching through a set of stolen binoculars as 3 men rolled a crate marked fentanyl onto a dolly. Disgust curled in his stomach. This wasn't just about power for Dalton and aldermen. This was poison, and tonight it ended. With a slow, practiced breath, David pressed the button. A dull thump echoed through the night as the first explosion ripped through the south side of the warehouse. Fire bloomed instantly, licking at the sky as screams erupted inside. Men scrambled, guns drawn, shouting orders that were lost beneath the roar of flames. David moved fast. Slipping through the chaos, he weaved between panicked workers, striking hard, fast elbows, knife edges, pressure points. He was a ghost in the firelight, a phantom tearing through the last remnants of Dalton's operation. By the time the first sirens wailed in the distance, David was already gone. In his place, he left a single bullet and a note. "You took everything, now it's my turn." The old training facility sat in the middle of nowhere, forgotten by the world. Once a proud symbol of law enforcement, it had been left to decay just like the men who had once trained here. Tonight, it would serve its final purpose. Sheriff Dalton's convoy approached cautiously, headlights cutting through the darkness. The mercenaries he had hired moved in, first ex-military, the kind of men who thought they'd seen everything. They were wrong. A single floodlight clicked on, illuminating a chair in the center of the clearing. Dalton's gut twisted when he saw what was in it. Morris, one of his own officers, bound and gagged. A camera on a tripod faced him, its red recording light blinking like a heartbeat. "Cross," Dalton's voice cut through the night. "Show yourself." Silence. Then, from the shadows, a voice colder than the wind. "Send your men away, Sheriff." Dalton tightened his grip on his shotgun. "Like hell I will." The first shot rang out, precise and controlled. One of Dalton's hired guns crumpled before he even registered he was hit. Panic spread. The mercenaries took defensive positions, scanning the darkness. Another shot, another man down. Dalton's pulse pounded. This wasn't a fight, this was execution. He turned, ready to call for retreat, and came face to face with David Whitman. A fist like a hammer slammed into his gut, knocking the air from his lungs. Dalton collapsed to his knees, coughing. Before he could reach for his weapon, David grabbed his collar and hauled him forward, dragging him toward the chair. Dalton gasped, his world spinning. "You gonna kill me?" David stepped back, tapping the camera. "If I wanted you dead," he said, voice calm, "you'd already be in the ground." The red light blinked. "No, Sheriff." I want something much worse. The courtroom was packed. News cameras lined the back wall, their lenses capturing every movement, every breath. The trial of Sheriff Dalton and Martin Caldwell had become the biggest legal battle Oak Ridge had ever seen. David Whitman sat quietly at the defense table, his expression unreadable. The past months had been a war of evidence, testimonies, and exposing the rot buried deep within the town. He had fought in the shadows, but now he let the law take over. The prosecution had presented everything: financial records, video footage, witness statements. The jury had seen the truth, and now the verdict. The judge's voice rang through the silent courtroom. On the charges of conspiracy, murder, and corruption guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Dalton clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. Caldwell slumped in his chair, pale, defeated. David exhaled slowly. It was over. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs, his attorney, Lisa Foster, turned to him. "This is a win, David. The justice system worked." He looked at her, then at the people in the gallery, Sarah's former students, community members who had lived under Dalton's rule for too long. "No," he said quietly, "justice isn't a verdict. It's what happens next." Foster frowned. "What do you mean?" David leaned forward, his voice firm. "Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about rebuilding what they destroyed. We can't let power go unchecked again. People need to stay involved, demand better, fight for what's right before it gets this far." He stood, glancing at Dalton one last time. Revenge had been easy, but justice, that was a battle that never really ended. The wind whispered through the cemetery, carrying the crisp scent of autumn. David Whitman stood before the simple headstone, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared. Sarah Whitman, beloved wife, teacher, mentor. Her light continues. The words carved into the stone felt both permanent and inadequate. No inscription could capture who she was, the way she had lifted others, the way she had believed in people even when they didn't believe in themselves. David exhaled slowly. "It's over," he murmured. Dalton got 30 years. Caldwell, 25. The others are turning on each other. He swallowed, his throat tightening. They can't hurt anyone else now. Silence. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, but Sarah didn't answer. She never would. For months, his world had been fire and vengeance. Each step had been fueled by purpose, by the singular drive to tear down the corrupt empire that took her away. But now, standing here, with no more enemies left to fight, an unsettling question crept into his mind. What now? Behind him, footsteps crunched on the gravel path. He turned to see Jessica, Sarah's best friend, a community leader who had stepped up in the chaos. "You know," she said, crossing her arms, "Sarah used to say your strength wasn't in how you fought. It was in how you helped people heal." David looked away. "I don't know how to do that." Jessica tilted her head. "You already did." He frowned. She gestured toward the town beyond the cemetery. "The kids at the community center, the people who stood up when you exposed the truth. They're not afraid anymore, David. That's because of you." A long pause. David looked at the headstone one last time, then nodded. He had spent so long fighting the past. Maybe it was time to start building the future. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Justice wasn't just about ending corruption. It was about what came after.